All right, here we are. Welcome back to Book Wave, the book club podcast. I'm your host, Scottsley, joined today with a special guest, Dragons in Genesis, aka Jason Foux. And as well as always, Jason, aka Synapsian.
Howdy.
So today we're continuing on in the Holy Bible Book Club, and we're at the book of Proverbs. So just to get the ball rolling with our guest, Jason Foux, a.k.a. Dragons in Genesis podcast, what Bible are you working through when you read the Bible, or what versions are you familiar? And specifically, what did you think about the book of Proverbs, or what kind of a relationship you have with the book of Proverbs?
As far as which version of the Bible, I don't use just one. On the show I use anywhere from like 2 to 5 different Bibles, and I'll like examine them side by side if there are like significant differences or something. And sometimes that makes a difference. Other times the difference is, so minute that it doesn't really matter. If you're looking at something like Proverbs, some portions of the Bible or some versions of the Bible have certain portions of Proverbs in a different order. Once you get past, I believe, chapter 22, the arrangement can vary depending on which version you're looking at. Most mainstream Bibles are going to be pretty consistent, though some of the ones I have will have, I think, like chapter 24 shows up after chapter 30. And there's like some things that have been kind of moved around. And that's just because like different textual traditions, when they were compiling these things, they were putting them together in different orders. And so like 1 to 22 is pretty much set in stone. After that, things can get a little hinky depending on the version. But I usually use, for the Old Testament, I'll use the Septuagint, the JPS Tanakh, the Catholic Old Testament, and there's another one, and it just flew right out of my head.
Oh, there's so many of them.
New International Version. And I'll often have like those 4 open at the same time, and I'll go through like, one section out of each one, and compare them all to see if there's anything of major difference. As far as the actual contents of Proverbs goes, most of it, as far as like which version you use and like which translations and everything, a lot of it is pretty consistent, and I think that's due in large part to the fact that the material, there isn't a lot that they really need to do to it to get the point across. A lot of it is just like, here's how good people behave, and this is what bad people do, and you can translate a lot of that pretty easily. There are a few verses where the exact translation is unknown, so it'll vary from one to another. But for the most part, it doesn't matter too much. Like the wording may be a little different, but the point is the same. But I was using the JPS Tanakh, so basically the Jewish Bible from the Jewish Publication Society, and the Septuagint. Those were the 2 that I was using while reading Proverbs.
Wow, that's really cool. I started with the King James version, right? And it was getting me nowhere. It felt like I was reading Shakespeare or something. And I switched over to the expanded Bible, and I found that was much simpler. I don't know if that makes me a simple person or a foolish person, but it was so much easier to read.
Yeah, I personally really like the Shakespearean language of it, so I've stuck with the King James Bible, but every once in a while I'll come across a line and be like, now, what do you really mean by that? And I'll look up all the different versions from all the different Bibles, like see the same one line just translated 50 times, and it's like, okay, now I can get a better handle on it. But we've run into the problem of like the reordering like before as well, because when we were talking with our friend Two More V's, Marvin, he was using the Orthodox Study Bible. So we were looking at Psalm 16, and he's like, no, that's 17, or it was the other way around. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, because in Psalms, there's a certain point at which there's like one psalm is either split into two parts or two psalms are combined into one. And so from that point toward the end, the numbering changes, and you'll either be, ahead by one or behind by one, depending on what you're looking at. And then near the end, it does it again, but in the opposite direction, so that, from then to the end of it, you end up with the same amount of psalms. Unless, of course, you're looking at some of the Greek manuscripts that have an extra psalm tacked on to the end. I think in Codex Sinaiticus we find one. It has 151 psalms. There are a couple other early Christian manuscripts where it has this 151st in there. And a fragment of that one was discovered at Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it wasn't like a Christian edition. It was something that they had, but not everybody had it. So yeah, things like that, they kind of get weird, and that's one of the fun things that we do on the Dragons of Genesis podcast is look at all the different variants and try to figure out like where they came from, where they how it's different, and if there's any theological implications and things like that.
So when was the first time you ever read Proverbs? Because I used to be part of a church, like a Baptist church, and I'm sure I've crossed over one of these verses before, but I'm like 40 now, so this is the first time I've actually sat down and read through the whole thing. How did you get interested in the Bible?
So, trying to think, about 17 years ago, somewhere around there, I had some different like theological questions. I wasn't getting good answers, so I decided to pick up the Bible and read the thing, like start to finish. And like that's not a thing that Catholics normally do, and that's not like a disparaging remark against Catholics. It's just so much of Catholic theology comes from external sources, and so there's only like certain parts of the Bible that most Catholics typically pay attention to. So beginning at Genesis and reading the whole thing wasn't really a priority for most Catholics, and it certainly wasn't for me. So I picked it up and I decided to read the whole thing. And over the course of, I don't know, maybe about a year or two, somewhere around there, I'm not exactly sure, I'd read through the entire Bible. And that's what got me really interested in it, was like seeing some of these unexpected little details in there, like when you're reading the flood story and it's almost like every detail gets duplicated. It's like, this is how many animals were put on the ark. And then a few lines later, this is how many, and it's a different number. Or this is how long the flood lasted. Oh no, this is how long it lasted. And it was like these little doublets. And that got me extremely fascinated into the story. And so I started reading about the Bible while reading the Bible, so I could learn like the explanation for why there were two different flood stories, in like chapters 7 through 9, and where they both came from, and why the details were different. Like, was there significance in the difference in details? And so it was while reading the Bible that it got me extremely fascinated in it. And at that point, I became less concerned about the theology and more concerned about the literature, the stories themselves. And by the time I got to the end of the Bible, to an extent, I had sort of divorced myself from the theological aspects of the book and became extremely focused on just the book itself and just learning about that. And so that was 15 to 17 years ago, somewhere around there. And wow. been kind of I've gone back and I've read, I've read through the book a few more times, reading different versions of it and reading it alongside like scholarly commentaries and other books about specific books of the Bible. And it was while doing that I got the idea to start the podcast. And that was, I believe, about 6 years ago, something like that.
Wow.
I was just learning too many things. So I wanted to basically just prattle to people about the interesting things I was learning, and that's where the podcast came from.
Sure, that's kind of how we.
It's funny, we almost did it the other way around. We were just like, let's read some books together, and then we're like, why don't we record this? And then somewhere along the lines, it was like, we should do the Bible if we're gonna do a book club podcast, right? Like, that's the book, right?
Well, yeah, like I would read books and like, talk to my wife about it, and eventually we met up and kind of formed this book club where we could have meaningful conversations, and I wouldn't annoy my wife with all my theories and stuff. But what you were saying a minute ago, Jason, kind of tied into my next question. Is like, I've heard that Proverbs is called something part of the wisdom books, along with Job and the next book, Ecclesiastes. Is Psalms not considered part of the wisdom books? And a follow-up question to that is, when were these books written and who wrote them? The Proverbs specifically.
Yeah, so Proverbs is part of the wisdom literature. And what that means is it's a sort of it's basically like a foundational part of ancient Jewish theology. And it's this idea that there's this sort of inherent like rightness or morality to the universe, and you sort of need to uncover it. And it's not going to be easy, and you can't actually do it on your own. You can try, and you're going to fail. But if you try and you basically start the journey to try to become a better person, then wisdom sort of becomes a divine gift. So you have to like take the first steps, and then you get a little nudge to push you along the path. And it goes back to this ancient idea of sort of like divine information. This is sort of like the Prometheus story. You have certain things that humanity is meant to know and certain things that they aren't. And if it's given to humanity properly, then it's a good thing. If it's not done properly, then, it angers the gods, or it can lead to catastrophe or something like that. And the ancient literature is permeated with this idea and examples of these stories. And that's what it's talking about when we say like wisdom literature. And it's this idea that there's certain almost inherent truths to the universe. And Proverbs is filled with this, like a good man does this while the wicked man does this. And it's basically like distilling reality into a sort of like series of black and white scenarios. A person possessing of wisdom, they will inevitably behave a certain way, and they will be rewarded a certain way because of that behavior. While a person who doesn't possess wisdom will be wicked, and they will behave differently. And it's not meant to be exactly taken literally. It's meant to be sort of just a guide. And there's actually examples like in Proverbs where it talks about how like, the wicked people are punished and they never prosper. And then a couple lines later, it's like, now don't envy those wicked people. Meaning the authors knew that sometimes the wicked prosper, and it kind of flies in the face of what they're saying, but they're like, just ignore it. They'll get their punishment eventually, and don't envy them, okay? And obviously, if they were being punished all the time for their wickedness, then no one would envy them for that, So it was sort of this. Wisdom is basically this idea of not just morality, but also just ways of making your life easier. There's examples of, being studious, hard work, making clever financial decisions, things like that. And all of this comes from wisdom. And wisdom, of course, comes from their deity. And it's sort of passed on to them. And maybe you learn it from a teacher, maybe you learn it, from a priest or a king. But either way, it's usually passed on through some intermediary to the student. And adhering to this wisdom will guide you in your life and increase your chances of prosperity. And Psalms is usually grouped with the wisdom stuff, though I think that's just because they kind of wanted to like simplify where everything went. There are parts of the Psalms that do include a lot of like wisdom teachings. The book of Job frequently refers to certain psalms, and it's parts of it that are concerned with wisdom, because that's what Job is all about. And so, yeah, psalms are part of the wisdom traditions, though there's also a lot of them in there that are just they're like different sorts of like praise music. There are some of them in there that are meant to be used whenever you enthrone a new king, stuff like that. It's, Psalms is like a collection of different songs for a variety of different purposes. So some of them would fit better into the wisdom theme than others, but the collection as a whole, yeah, you can think of it as wisdom literature.
Sure, thanks. I got the distinct feeling that the book of Job was kind of a bit more ancient than, but like before the time of kings, for example. When do you think that the book of Proverbs was written? Because some of them are attributed to Solomon, but I also got the feeling that there were things added to it later, more recently.
Yeah, with a great many books that you find in the Bible, Job and Proverbs among them, they seem to have been assembled in layers. Like Job, the prologue and the epilogue aren't actually connected to the main body of the text. And if you actually examine like what's said in the prologue and what's said in the main body of the text, you realize there are like staggering differences. And it's like there was this collection of this collection of monologues, and there was this this story about this sort of like divine intervention in this man's life, and they were completely separate, and they were merged together. And then there were other parts of the story of Job that were added even later, like what's his name? Was it Elihu? I think it was like the fourth speaker who comes in like way at the end. That's like at the tail end of it. That was never part of the text. No one in the text knows anything about this guy. He pops up out of nowhere. Like at the end of it, God doesn't even know about him because he keeps talking about Job's three friends. And this fourth guy, like no one knows where he comes from. And he never even says anything original. He's just repeating things that other people said. And then he actually references things from the later chapters that God is going to say. And then there's this poem about wisdom that got added to it. So it was done in about 4 different layers. And some scholars even debate whether or not the inclusion of Satan in the first 2 chapters was even part of those chapters. Right. Because you can actually chop out those mentions of him, and that the prologue minus the mentions of the Satan, if you chop out the Satan, then the prologue and the epilogue match up much better.
Yeah.
Whereas if you put the Satan back in, then you've got these problems when you compare the prologue and the epilogue. It's like, what? Because at the end of it, God's talking about the things that he did. But in the beginning of it, it's the Satan who's doing them. And it's like, wait, what?
That's literally what I said.
Then it matches up. Yeah, it's a multi-layered thing. I'm actually covering Job right now on the podcast. The next episode will drop probably next week. And we go through the whole thing. Like we break it down into the layers. We don't go like chapter 1 to the end. We start with what scholars believe is the oldest layer, and then we move on to like the latest layer and examine each layer independently, and it's a lot of fun. And Proverbs is similar. So the Proverbs, you can break it up into about 8 different sections. There's like this section about wisdom, and that's like the first 9 chapters of Proverbs. Then chapters 10 to 22, verse 16, is this big collection of Proverbs. That's another section. Then you have 2 different sayings of the wise, 22:17 to 24:22, and then 24:23. Was it?
It's like maybe to 29.
Yeah,
There was
like
one
24:23 until the end of it, and then you have 20 chapters 25 to 29 is another collection. Then you have chapter 30 is another collection. Chapter 30, the beginning of 31 is another collection. And then chapter 31, verses 10 to 31 is the poem about the good wife. And so that gives you like 8 different like sections that were assembled. And once you get past chapter 22, verse 16, depending on the text you're looking at, the order changes. So what scholars think happened was there was this collection of Proverbs, and it was like chapters 10 to 22:16. And that was the kernel of it. That was the beginning. And then at some point later, chapters 1 through 9 got added to the beginning of that. And that became the second layer. And then in a relatively short period of time, people were taking other collections of Proverbs that had already been gathered up, like 22 to 24, end of 24, 25 to 29, the beginning 30, the beginning of 31, and then the poem of the good wife. And they started stitching all of those onto the end of this larger collection. And they didn't always do it in the same order. So you could end up with like 22 to 24, and then the end of 24 wasn't added yet. You ended up with like 25 to 29, and then 30, and then the end of 24, and then 31, something like that. And it kind of varies a bit. And as far as when these things were done, people are still putting out theories. The problem with it is there's not anything in the way of a narrative to the book. It's mostly concerned with advice. It's telling people, what they should do, how they should behave, the consequences of their actions, how living a certain way can affect their family or the community. Things they should stay away from, the warnings and things like that. And then it has these poems that get inserted into it. And none of these things have much in the way of context. Like you read the things and it doesn't say anything about any characters that we know. Like there'll be a little title that gets inserted onto the end of the beginning of a section, but proverb literature, whether in the Bible or elsewhere, that's the thing that happens. People, they collect a series of quotes, and then if they want the quotes to have more authority, then they'll add the name of a famous person to them, or they'll add their own name to it. And this was extremely common, especially in proverb literature. Many collections of Proverbs, this exact same thing happens to it. People will take 100 different, famous sayings, they'll write them all down and then stick their own name on it, or the name of a great wise man. A perfect example of this is you can see this meme going around where it says something about how if the bees go extinct, then humanity won't be far behind. And it's attributed to Albert Einstein, as if Albert Einstein was ever concerned with bee populations. And as if he knew anything about hive collapse, which wasn't generally known until the late 20th century, decades after he had died. And what's funny is in that particular example, I remember when that was going around in email chains and it was just like an anonymous quote. And then in the days of MySpace, it was going around again as a Native American proverb. And so it's like, basically every 10 years, it just gets recycled and they just say, I need a smart guy to have said this. Oh, Einstein is smart. Like this physicist is talking about hive collapse. Like, what are you talking about? And that's exactly what we have here. We have parts of it attributed to Solomon. We have parts of it attributed to, I think the fifth section, 25 to 29, is said to have been collected by Hezekiah. We have Agar and Lemuel as another two sections, with names attached to them. And what's funny is we can actually trace some of these, like chapters 22 to 24. They're actually Egyptian in origin. Eventually people discovered a text in Egypt dating back I think 4,000 years or something like that. Yeah. And it's this whole big collection of sayings. And when you match it up side by side with those two chapters of Proverbs, not only is the wording of an individual passage nearly identical, and in some cases they're copied verbatim, but you're even finding these things in almost the identical order. And they're like, oh, and so now it's just the general scholarly opinion that chapters 22 to 24, they came from Egypt. The ones from Agar and King Lemuel came from Arabia. And you can actually go and find these ancient Arabian sayings. And there's even bits in the words where it's obvious that it was being translated from an Arabian language into Hebrew whenever they were writing, whenever they were copying it into Proverbs. But unfortunately, these things, they don't give us any kind of context, any kind of time frame. All we really know is it was done in layers. And it could have taken, a generation or two. It could have taken a few centuries. It could have started in 1100 BC and continued on to 300 BC. There's really no way to tell.
I think there's a lot of evidence for that in the majority of the Bible, because how many times has the Great Flood myth been told, right? Was it Thoth or Upnapishtim, or which one was it really? So it's when you talk about them going backwards to say oh no, this was really Solomon or David that wrote this, a lot of it's bringing it back forward, the one episode of The Office where it shows Michael Scott with the quote behind him with you miss every shot you don't take, Wayne Gretzky, Michael Scott. It's I said it. It's his quote, but I said it, so now it's mine, and everyone will remember it that way from here on out.
just claim it.
Yeah, even if Solomon wrote it down, he may have gotten it from, I think I heard something about the instructions of Amenhotep as the Egyptian source. So he may have heard it. These are probably sayings that were going around.
So chapter 22 to 24 comes from a thing called the Wisdom of Amenemophis. That's Amenemophis. And you can actually find some things online. They're pretty easy to find. You can do Psalms Amenemophis, and people have actually done things where they've put the two texts side by side, so you can actually read it. And it's in this case, they were literally just copying a lot of these verbatim. And sometimes there'd be a couple of words that were changed, but they don't really change anything, or there'll be a phrase that would get added to the end of it. But one of the things about Solomon is there's a boatload of literature that would, over the course of multiple centuries, be attributed to him. of course, we have like the Proverbs. And what's kind of interesting about the book of Proverbs is it doesn't actually say that Solomon wrote it. It just says like it's the Proverbs of Solomon, or the Proverbs of Hezekiah or something like that. And this could also mean that it was collected by this person. So it could just be, sort of like how Ben Franklin published a big book of Proverbs, and it wasn't things that he came up with. It was just Proverbs that he had heard, and so he published them. But we also have like the Song of Solomon, which is, I believe, originally it was a Babylonian song that got repurposed. And then we have the Odes of Solomon, the Testament of Solomon, the Key of Solomon, the Sword of Solomon. And these things were written over the course of centuries. I think like the Key of Solomon is only a couple hundred years older than the Gospels. So we're talking like some fairly late literature. And all these things get attributed to Solomon because if you're writing a piece of Jewish literature and you want it to sound wise, well, you attribute it to the wisest man in Jewish history, and that is Solomon the Wise. And so, yeah, there's like you've got like enough material to make up half the Old Testament that gets attributed to this one guy, and we have no evidence that he wrote any of it. It may all have come from later generations. It's just the problem is we don't know because it doesn't have any context, so we can't even pin it down to a century. The only real thing we have is... Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just like the mystery. Like, I think we should be more comfortable with being able to say, we don't know, instead of saying, no, it was definitely Solomon. It was definitely David. I just like more honesty in the conversation. Like, we still have the most important book in Western civilization, whether or not it was written by whoever we say it is, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We don't know if those were the authors. It's just those are the collections according to whatever goes by those titles.
Right.
So it's like, it doesn't really matter if some guy named John wrote the Gospel of John. We still have the Gospel of John, and like what survives is what matters. That's my opinion anyway.
There's this kind of mysterious metaphor. It's being portrayed in the beginning, first like 9 books of Proverbs, talking about wisdom as a metaphor for like a woman, possibly like the Greek goddess Sophia. What did you guys think about that?
Yeah, there's this scholar. Her name is Margaret Barker. I would issue the warning that if you decide to read her stuff, read her smaller, thinner books first, because her thicker material can literally give you headaches. Like, I'm not being facetious. I've actually gotten headaches from reading her books. It's the only material I've ever read that was so dense that it made my head hurt. But she goes deep into the older theology that is sort of present in the Old Testament, but seems to have been suppressed over the centuries. One of her big books on the topic is called The Older Testament, and it talks about different theological concepts that fell out of fashion in Judaism and were eventually like left behind, suppressed, labeled as like heretical, or apostate or whatever. And so she digs deep into those ideas, and one of the prominent features in there is this concept of the Lady of Wisdom, or she's also referred to as the Lady of Jerusalem. We actually have statues of her, and everything that we can find seems to be it's a holdover of a particular Canaanite goddess named Asherah. The worship of her was prominent throughout the region. And worship of her actually continued all the way into the Christian period. And we actually have we have inscriptions and things of people who are making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and they would like carve almost like graffiti onto a wall basically saying how they're going to Jerusalem for this pilgrimage, uh, for the Lady of Jerusalem, for Asherah. And we have like descriptions of her and everything else. And she was believed to be like this consort of this great high god. And she actually gets mentioned a few times in the Old Testament. And this goddess, Asherah, if you look at the things that are said about the Lady of Wisdom, you can find that a lot of them match up with some of these Canaanite stories that we found in a city called Ugarit. That's Ugarit. It's in western Syria. A big library was discovered in the 20th century, and it was this huge trove of documents. And we learned a great deal about Canaanite mythology from them. And when people started to look at stories about Asherah and compare them to this wisdom goddess that keeps popping up, this Lady Wisdom or the Lady of Jerusalem, then people start to notice a lot of similarities.
Yeah.
And
There's
so,
one
yeah,
thing there's one thing that I noticed where it says it doesn't like outrightly say it, but it describes God as the masculine, and then it
mhm,
presents God's wisdom and understanding as feminine. So that kind of like,
mhm.
if it harkens back to like an older version where, God's wisdom and understanding was actually worshipped as its own deity and not just something
Yeah,
that belonged to the one, then that makes sense why that
yeah,
language is set up like that.
yeah. It looks like it's this holdover to a time when these were considered like completely separate. And we have these stories about how like in the early, like basically at the beginning of time, uh, the high god El, he creates his consort Asherah, and then together they create the whole universe and all of the other gods. And then we find this popping up in the Old Testament on a few different occasions. It gets briefly referenced in Job, and then it pops up more elsewhere, where it talks about how wisdom is almost like is like she predates creation. She was
Hmm.
there at the foundation of the universe, and like she gets created, and then like the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth and everything else that comes later. And it's like the power of God is almost like focused through her, and then the universe gets created. It's created through wisdom. And it looks like this is an adaptation of this truly ancient story. Like the writings are in cuneiform. It's this truly ancient story where the god El Elyon, he creates his consort, and then together they create everything else. The other gods, the whole universe. It all gets created, and she's almost like she's not exactly like a conduit for his power, not at that early stage, but you can see the connection. And later it becomes where in like early Judaism, um, he's creating the universe through her. She's there at the beginning, at the beginning of the time, at the foundation of the world. And then gradually wisdom sort of gets absorbed, so that wisdom is a part of God. And it talks about how to know wisdom, you have to fear God, and wisdom comes from God. And it's so you can see how it starts as uh, there's like this ancient Canaanite idea, and then gradually it it changes a bit. And in the early stages of Judaism, it's this almost like wisdom personified sort of character.
Yeah.
And then gradually that just sort of gets absorbed. So it's not like wisdom is personified in this female entity. It's now there's like a softer side to God. And so you have his strength, this more masculine side, and then you have this softer wisdom side that's more thoughtful and introspective, and that's like this feminine side. And then eventually that also kind of gets completely merged. So it's not even just two different sides. it's just like one homogeneous thing, and God is he is both powerful and wise. And so you can almost trace it over the course of a couple thousand years as it goes from a completely separate entity all the way down to being essentially just non-existent. And you can see as the wisdom goddess becomes less prominent, the traits of this divine wisdom become more and more the purview of the God of Israel. And Margaret Barker does some fascinating research into that topic. I believe the Older Testament is one book that has like I think an entire chapter devoted just to that idea. But I would actually advise against reading that at first.
Mhm.
She has one called Temple Theology. I would read that before you read the Older Testament, and get some ibuprofen ready, because it feels like your brain is getting rewritten, like you're in the Matrix or something.
Wow.
It's dense. Like, I've literally never had this happen with any other author. Yeah, she has some fascinating work. I want to actually do a deeper dive into this idea of the wisdom character, because it is an important figure in the Old Testament. It pops up throughout the books,
Yeah.
usually in just little vague references. But she does pop up a little bit more prominently in Proverbs.
There was one verse in Proverbs where it actually said Yahweh stood next to wisdom when he was creating the universe. And it's kind of what you mentioned. And I'm wondering,
Yeah.
she kind of disappears. Did Sophia or this goddess of wisdom, this Ashura, did she kind of get turned into the tree of knowledge of good and evil? And then
Huh.
humans ate her?
I kind of want to
And
try
she
to
disappeared?
steel man the Christian argument a little bit. I won't be able to do it very well, but I think they would say that the transition from like paganism, like polytheism, into monotheism was a necessary change, because you would just be too distracted with other gods as to like reach the true ideal. So like, instead of having wisdom as a separate deity, have it as a tool of the one deity, so you're not like torn between two different worlds. You have the focus of one almighty God, which everybody can worship together, all on the same playing field, and then kind of phase out the idea, not like specifically the deity, but the idea of multiple deities, to be able to unite everyone underneath that one deity. What do you think about that?
Right. Sort of do away with the individuality of these different concepts, and sort of like group them together under like one banner, sort of. Yeah, it's monotheism, when it comes to like from a theological perspective, monotheism definitely solves a lot of problems. And we can actually see, going all the way back to like ancient Egypt, Persia, and then in Israel, we do see that process occurring, and every time it pops up, it solves a lot of the same problems. With under King Akhenaten in Egypt, we have it in Persia with Zoroastrianism. Then we start to see it in Judaism shortly thereafter. It's if you can simplify the thing and kind of put everything under one banner, then it definitely makes things a lot easier for people to comprehend, to get behind. You have you can get rid of a certain amount of conflict, because if you need everyone on the same page, but each person has their own favorite deity. I mean, like the soldiers are typically following a war god, but then you have the farmers following a fertility god, who's associated with like weather and grain. And then you have, the sailors following someone like Poseidon. Well, if you can get them all under one roof, then it certainly makes things a lot easier from a variety of perspectives. So yeah, that is definitely that's definitely a benefit of that type of thinking. Now, Jason, you had a question a second ago, and I
Hmm.
lost it. What was it you had
Did
asked?
I?
Like,
What
oh,
happened to
the
wisdom?
tree, the tree.
Yeah, did
Yeah.
Asherah
So
become the tree and then
one
disappeared
of
because we ate her?
yeah. So in Canaanite mythology, Asherah had a couple of different prominent symbols. One was a spindle, usually with like red thread on it. Not necessarily red, but often, like when a color is mentioned, it's usually red. And she had some association with like weaving. And her other prominent symbol was a tree, and this
Hmm.
tree had fruit that would give wisdom. And this
Wow.
tree was guarded by a serpent god named Nehushtan,
No
the
kidding.
same word we find in Genesis 3. He also makes a brief appearance in Numbers 21, I believe. The Israelites, they get attacked by these venomous snakes and they erect an idol to the god Nehushtan.
Hmm.
And those who pray to the idol, they get cured of the venom. And this was a tale that they were trying to justify, like, still having these idols to the god Nehushtan in their temple after they had gone toward monotheism. And like the story ends with them saying, "Oh, and that's why we have this bronze serpent in our temple to this very day." These are people, in the Jerusalem temple, and they're like, "Okay, look, we're all supposed to be monotheistic, but we still have these statues to these other gods in here, and people are still praying to them. We need to find a way around this." And that was one of the attempts they made. They basically put a sort of I guess a Yahwistic pedigree on it. They're like, no, no, it's not bad. Yahweh said it was okay. Look, we have this story where he says to do this thing. And of course the story mentions like events that are, like it mentions the status of the temple and this statue within it like centuries later. So obviously this is a much later story. And they're trying to basically say this is why we still worship snakes in our temple, even though we don't worship these other gods. This is actually a symbol of Yahweh's power. And it's one of these things we can see along the transition. This was a separate entity that guarded Asherah's tree of life and wisdom. And eventually they got rid of it. And this is a transitional story. But yeah, Asherah was one of her symbols was the tree of wisdom, or this great fruit tree. And like wisdom and life were both benefits of eating of the fruit, though in the story it's been separated. And some scholars believe that this had to do with a certain feature of architecture, that basically there was like a maybe gates to a sacred grove or something, and it had like double doors. And the symbol of Asherah, this tree, was on both doors. And originally it was just a duplicate or a mirror image of the same symbol. But eventually, since it represented both wisdom and life, people decided that maybe the one on the left is wisdom and the one on the door on the right is life.
Like, yeah.
And so then the story becomes it being two separate trees. Um, and, anyway, we get that whole thing. And there, the Eden story, we could do an entire episode on this. It's this multi-layered thing, and part of it involves a sort of casting out of older theologies. And so the idea of like the people being forced out for taking this wisdom is this idea of they were basically getting wisdom sort of like straight from the source instead of going through Yahweh. And so it's like, no, no, no,
Mm.
you can't go to Asherah directly anymore. There's no such thing as Asherah. There's no goddess of wisdom. Wisdom comes from the priests of Yahweh. They run the temple. And the whole Garden of Eden is meant to actually represent the temple. And so basically, it's sort of a rejection of the idea that you can have any other style of worship. You have to go through this one specific source. At least that's one layer to the story. There's like several. Um, But yeah, basically the Asherah is technically present in the garden. She's the tree. She's the fruit of wisdom. And her guardian, Nehushtan, he's the one over there, like, oh yeah, you can totally have this wisdom. And then this new theology is coming in saying, no, no, you can't. You have to get your knowledge through Yahweh.
Yeah, that kind of
And
reminds me.
that's around the same time as Yahweh sort of, or wisdom sort of becoming part of Yahweh and not a separate
Right.
thing.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of one of my conversations with Two More V's when I was questioning him about paganism versus monotheism or whatever, and making the point about like, well, some people could see themselves in, one of the lesser gods and find their way to the ideal better that way than just focusing on just Yahweh and what you see as Yahweh. And then he says, well, that's why the veneration of the saints is so important, because when you're talking about like pagan gods and like Norse theology, if you worship Tyr, Tyr only points to himself. If you worship Odin or Thor, those deities only point to themselves. They just want you to worship them and have that interaction with you. But if you venerate the saints, then they still point to something higher. So it's, you still have the chief ideal up here, which is God, and then you have the different routes of reaching that ideal through the saints. And then just the idea of the snake, I'm like, so like that's the same snake that was on the Moses's staff, right? The bronze serpent. So symbology pops up everywhere, right?
Yeah, yeah. And this is a common symbol. I mean, we have like the staff of Asclepius. I mean, this is on the back of every ambulance in the country. This idea of a snake and a staff being associated with healing. This is a ancient symbol. It probably predates writing. And a lot of this, like we find it in Gilgamesh. He swims down, he finds this thing that's going to give him eternal life. He comes back to the shore, he sets it down, but then he's tired, so he takes a nap, and the snake comes and eats it, and then the snake becomes immortal instead of Gilgamesh. This is these ancient stories, and a lot of it comes from people seeing these snakes. They look kind of gray and faded, and they think, oh man, the snake is old, and then it sheds its skin and it's like bright and shiny again. Like, oh my God, it just renews itself. And it's like these things are immortal. We have these stories going back thousands of years, and that's where this comes from. The idea that a snake is associated, with like this sort of divine immortality.
Yeah. Human beings have had like three major predators. Like three major predators in all of humanity's history. Like the snake is number one, and the cat, and then the bird. So it's like you see those pop up a lot in all mythology everywhere too. Wherever there's cats, there's people writing about how cats are associated with deities.
Yeah, and snakes, they definitely played an important role because, like, one thing they would, when you have agriculture, you have grain storage, and then you have rodents trying to eat all the grain, but then you have snakes coming in and killing the rodents, so it's beneficial. But if you step on the wrong snake, then you die. So there's like this strange relationship that they have with snakes. They're beneficial. They're also potentially deadly. And like in Numbers 21, we actually see both. There are snakes killing people, and then they pray to a snake and they get healed. And we actually, in this one like half of chapter 21, we see both sides of their relationship with these animals being represented.
There's definitely a division of thoughts on this idea too. You'll have the camp that's like the only good snake is a dead snake, and then the other side is like, well, you don't really need to kill them. They'll just mind their own business if you don't, corner
Well, here's
them.
The real question. How do you cure a snake bite? With snake venom. There's no difference between the poison and the cure. So that's why it's the medical symbol. It's how do you heal a snake bite? You diluted venom, or you suck all the poison out. But that's the way to do it. Like once you take a poison in, you can, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? You get used to it, and then you're immune to it. So it does and give you that medical gift, but it also kills you. So literally a double-edged sword.
The other interesting thing about the whole fear of God being a core requirement to gain wisdom is kind of also represented in one of the, I believe, the first of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was kind of significant. One of the things I was thinking about while reading the 10 Commandments and Proverbs is like, were the cultures surrounding the Israelites, the Canaanites, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, were their, I guess, beliefs, their postulates, their practices significantly different than the Israelites, such to an extent that they felt they needed to write down these ways to live a good life instead of living an evil life?
In some ways, there were significant differences, and in other ways, with the exception of like the styles of clothing, you may not have been able to tell them apart. So, like, there were certain, like, of course, like dietary differences. We see this popping up in most of the Old Testament. Like Esther is one of the exceptions. They don't talk about any dietary differences. They actually have the Israelites, sitting at other people's tables and eating their food, and no one has any problem with this. But Esther's this sort of anomaly when it comes to the Old Testament, and that's this whole rabbit hole.
Well, that was
that
after
would take forever to go through.
the temple fell, right?
Yeah. It's set in during the like exilic period. So
Okay.
Babylon came in, they destroyed the temple, and then the Persians come in, they defeat Babylon, and it takes place during that time period.
Right.
But so through most of the Old Testament, there's like this stress on like these certain dietary restrictions. You don't eat certain types of animals. And so like they didn't eat pork. At least some of the Jews didn't eat pork, some others did. Now there were people in their area that also did not eat pork. The people in ancient Israel getting away from pork seems to have been like a gradual process. And certain areas got away from it earlier than others. Others kept doing it for centuries longer. But it didn't really look like it was almost like a line in the sand sort of thing, where a certain group of people just did not eat it and the next group over did. That was sort of a gradual development. Eventually, they got to the point where it was an intrinsic part of their identity, and they used that to differentiate themselves from other cultures, because by that point, they did not eat pork at all. But they did have other neighbors who also didn't eat pork. And actually their method for determining whether or not they could eat an animal, you find this, I believe, in Leviticus, where it talks about like, it basically defines, it's almost like a crude taxonomy. They define what a proper herd animal is. A proper herd animal, it walks on 4 legs, it has cloven hooves, it chews cud. Of course, a pig doesn't chew cud, so it's not a proper herd animal. And then you have a camel. It walks on 4 legs, it chews cud, but it doesn't have hooves, it has paws, so it's not a proper herd animal. And then they mess up. They say that rabbits chew cud, but we know that rabbits aren't actually ruminants. They just periodically like wiggle their mouth and they think, oh, they're chewing cud. But they're excluded because they have paws instead of hooves. And so they do this, and this is how they identify whether or not something was a proper herd animal. And this is something that scholars think they got from the Persians. Their religion of Zoroastrianism, they had this idea that their god, Ahura Mazda, had created all the animals in the world. But then this evil entity, who was almost like an evil twin, named Ahriman the Opposer, he came in And he decided he wanted to mess up creation. He was going to corrupt the entire world. And one of the ways he did it was making a bunch of fake animals. And his animals, they looked like normal animals, but there was always one little detail that was slightly off. And so he basically made like herd animals, but then he gave them like the wrong type of feet or something. So, or maybe they didn't chew cud. So he would take something like a cow and he'd remake it, and it would have cloven hooves and walk on 4 legs, but then it wouldn't chew cud. And so you couldn't eat that because that wasn't a real animal. That was a corrupt abomination from Ahriman, and like, oh, he made lizards. Like lizards, they have scales and they have 4 legs and they run around. But then you have these lizards with no legs, and we call them snakes. Those are improper lizards. Or you have fish. A fish has gills and fins and scales, and it swims around. But then you have some that have like pinchers and legs. What is that? Well, yeah, these lobsters or crabs, those are improper fish, and so you don't eat them. And this is why Leviticus says that bats are a type of bird. They're trying to classify nature, and they're this external influence they're getting from Persia is telling them that if it doesn't fit into this neat taxonomy, it's an abomination that was created by this evil entity, Ahriman. And so they're like, that's why those bats don't have tails and feathers. They're improper birds. They're an abomination. We can't eat them. And so like these prohibitions on eating certain types of animals, a lot of that they share with the Persians, at least during a certain time period, and they shared it for the same reason. And we see this for other things, like so the Egyptians, they ate pork. They didn't have a problem with it. And so the Jews and the Egyptians definitely were not on the same page when it came to that. However, both of them practiced circumcision. And so they were in full agreement on that. Okay, well, yeah, we can both be circumcised.
The Egyptians did that.
Yeah. And there were a couple other cultures in the area that did. But basically what you find is, if you look at ancient Israel and their practices, and then you look at all of their neighbors, there's going to be a certain amount of overlap and a certain amount of discrepancy, which would make sense because it's essentially a crossroads. If you're in the Eastern Mediterranean and you want to trade with Egypt, you have to go through Israel. If you're in Arabia and you want to go over to Persia, you got to go through Israel. If you're in Babylon and you want to go into like southeastern Europe, you got to go right through Israel. And so there were a certain amount of things that were cross-cultural. Circumcision with the Egyptians, certain ways of classifying animals with the Persians, things like that. So yeah, they were different, but they also fit their context quite well. And I think the amount of differences you would find between them and any of their neighbors is about what you would expect to find between any two groups of people at the time. Different cultures did certain things differently, and the ancient Israelites were no exception. And that's actually something we find weird about Proverbs, is it doesn't make any mention of like ethnic differences the way we find elsewhere in the Bible. It's concerned with basically just doing certain things a certain way because it like has a benefit. You make careful financial decisions because if you do that, then you'll tend to be more successful than if you take, outrageous risks. That is like universal. It doesn't matter the culture. It talks about like, if you've got a family, you don't go running off to do other things. You need to be taking care of your family. Otherwise, your family's going to fall apart.
Yeah, that's
a universal truth.
Yeah.
It's like Proverbs, that's like, if there was one thing that would help us date Proverbs, it's that it seems to lack any indication that they thought of themselves as completely ethnically distinct, which seems to be a product of the Second Temple period.
Right.
That doesn't mean that this was assembled prior to that, like during the first temple before the Babylonians conquered them. But it would strongly indicate that these like 8 collections of proverbs that make up the book of Proverbs probably existed during the first temple period and were then like compiled together, you know, maybe during the second temple period, but likely existed before that. So maybe 7th century BCE. But
Okay.
again,
Yeah.
you ask a scholar and they'll propose another date. So
Sure.
Yeah. When I was reading it, I kind of got the feel that like they understood the commandments and like what God wanted them to do, but they were in the process of rediscovering why. So it definitely makes sense to me that the majority of it was written or at least put together in the second temple, like after Cyrus let them all go, because they would have been more multicultural at that point in time anyway, because they were all coming together and their religion was becoming more about what we do instead of, you know, who we are or where we came from, because we were all just enslaved by the Persians, so they have to start from scratch a little bit. So it's like, we know God doesn't want us to kill, but here's a proverb explaining about how we rediscovered why he doesn't want us to kill each other or go after your neighbor's woman or ladies in strange far off lands, stuff like that.
yeah. Chasing women is a very big part of Proverbs. Like every time you turn around, they're like, okay, hang on. Now, we got this stuff about being a good farmer, but let me tell you why chasing women is dangerous. And they keep going right back to that topic.
But Solomon has like what, 600 wives or something?
Yeah. Like between all of his wives and concubines, it comes out to like an even 1,000.
Wow.
So it's like, yeah, if you're gonna say that this collection came from Solomon, and your whole thing is, you know, don't go running off with strange women because it can lead you into trouble. And Solomon was constantly running off with strange women and even building temples so they could worship their other gods, which got him into trouble. Maybe that's not the best name to attach to this. Or maybe it shows that he learned from his experience. He's like, okay, hang on. After I had my 1,000 women,
Right.
let me tell you the mistakes I learned about.
Sure.
It's going to take a whole book. Let me sit down and write it. Yeah, a lot of the proverbs in here seem to have like more humble origins. Like there's a lot that seems to be devoted toward like young men who are just starting like their career or their family. We have a lot that seems to be like agricultural. You know, and it's directed at people who are like, you know, trying to build a house or start a farm, you know, when they're going to plant seeds and stuff like that. And so a lot of these things, they look to be like a collection of sayings from, at least a great many of them from like poorer people, you know, just like farmer wisdom. Though you do have little sprinklings of things that talk about like the king and the royal court. So at some point, these things were being used by like more well-to-do and you know, educated individuals who were bringing in their own sayings, you know, about how they deal with like different court officials and stuff like that. Experiences that your average farmer trying to build stables would have, you know, no reference for. So yeah, I think the sources for these sayings pretty much spans all of like ancient Israelite life, you know, from like lower class peasant all the way up to like court official and everything in between. And maybe over the course of a couple centuries as well.
Yeah. So I do have a couple other questions, but I do want to check in with you guys on time. How are y'all doing? Do you have anywhere to flee to?
I'm good.
Okay, sure. So in Proverbs 6:16, I noticed something interesting where it says the 6 or actually 7 kinds of people God hates, right? And this reminded me of the 7 deadly sins, but apparently that's something different than the 7 kinds of people God hates. It's prideful people, is the first one on the list. Deceitful people, people with lying tongues, false witnesses, people that have feet that be swift in running to mischief, people that sow discord amongst their brethren, and murderous people. And I was curious what you guys thought about, like, why is pride at the top of the list and considered to be also the cardinal deadly sin of the seven deadly sins? Because when I looked up the definition of pride, normally you think pride is a good thing. It could be a good thing, but it says it's differentiating yourself from others.
Mhm.
And I just felt that, like, are not the Israelites doing that very thing and saying that they have this covenant with God? So how do they not fall into that trap of being prideful while at the same time worshiping their God?
Yeah, I think one is the intended function of these collections of proverbs. Um, Scholars think that this was at least a lot of these were intended for basically just like educational purposes, and so these are things that would be like recited to students, to young people, uh, in their formative years, and if you have a student who is too prideful, then he's not going to listen to his instructor, which means he's going to, maybe go and run off with wicked women or something, or he's going to make like some really bad decisions. So they need to like take it down a peg, be more humble,
Okay.
and open themselves up to the learning and the instruction that they're being offered, specifically in the context of Proverbs, so they can then learn these things, and then once they do, then they'll be possessing of the knowledge and wisdom to go out and confidently make their decisions. And if you don't have that humility in the beginning, it's going to be very difficult to learn much of anything. Um, and it
It,
was kind of like what you were saying earlier. Like sometimes we have to be comfortable saying that we don't know. And if you're too prideful, you're never going to say that you don't know. You're going to just make up an answer, and it'll likely be the wrong answer. And so I think education, and you know, really most things in life kind of begins with just admitting that you don't know, being humble, and then trying to learn from there, like starting at zero and moving forward instead of pretending to know an answer. Um, of course, that's just my personal opinion, but I think it has merit within the context, since Proverbs seems to have been used to instill a certain amount of humility and education in young people. So
Mhm.
I think it would fit the context.
Yeah, it kind of brings to mind like a general question that we have in secular society today is, are people born good? Are they born evil? Or are they born just a blank slate? And I've never met a religious person who says, "Oh yeah, we're all born good," because like they understand the importance of instruction in that sense. Like humans aren't born good because in a religious perspective, we're not born to follow God's commandments. So you have to be taught that kind of thing, and you definitely need a certain amount of humility, because if you're running around like with a pagan attitude and it's just like, I got Thor and Odin on my side, I don't need any help from you guys. So it's like it goes back
Yeah.
to like the everything pointing to the ideal, the divine, or everything pointing to just yourself. And if you separate yourself from your own people, not like your group of people from another group of people, but if you separate yourself from your own peers, then that would easily be interpreted as a path to hell. Whether or not you believe in the afterlife, if you separate yourself, you're isolating yourself. And if you think like, I'm the one with all the right answers and these guys are all dumb, you're literally torturing yourself.
Well, it's interesting you say that about the kind of religious perspective. Kind of reminds me of the fall. Ever since Adam and Eve, humans have that proclivity towards evil. And there was a proverb. It was 29. It says, "No one can say I'm innocent. I've never done anything wrong." And I think that kind of hits the nail with the hammer on that one.
So here's a question. I don't think any of us are particularly really religious, so this would be a good question for all of us. But what do you think the role of the Bible, or specifically the book of Proverbs, should have in today's society for religious people or secular?
I mean, I got an answer for that, at least an attempt of an answer. I felt that there were some good sayings in this book. One of them, let's see, was 10:12. Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers all wrongs. There was definitely aspects of Proverbs that reminded me of like Eastern teachings, whether that be like Buddhist stuff and karma, and specifically, it was, I think, chapter 26. It read very similar to like Zen koans, like just as charcoal and wood keep a fire going, a quarrelsome person keeps an argument going. Like, I mean, I resonated with that. And as water reflects your face, so your mind shows what kind of person you are.
Yeah.
I mean, there's things there to ponder on, but there were also some things in Proverbs that I didn't quite understand or seem paradoxical. Like, I kind of laughed at some of the stuff about advice on your wife. Like in 26:15, it says, "A quarreling or contentious wife is as bothersome as a continual dripping on a rainy day, and restraining her is like stopping the wind or trying to grab oil in your hand." Or like, it's better to live alone in the desert than to live with an angry wife. I was like, yeah, I mean, I guess that's true to some extent.
So then how do you
Yeah,
think that those should be treated? Like, because it's kind of hard to have a conversation where one half of people believe that this was written by God or inspired by God, whatever that means to them. And it's like, so it is written, so it is done, this is what it is. And then you have someone like me who's just like, it's an old book, it's worth reading, it's good for you. Like, how do you reconcile those two things?
So Proverbs also reminded me of the Jordan Peterson book, 12 Rules for Life. And in one of his rules, it may have been in his second book, it's, don't throw out a whole religion just because you don't like it. There might be some good bits of wisdom in there, and I think that's the case with Proverbs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with what you said. There are some bits of Proverbs, actually a great deal of this book is timeless advice. And I think that was the point. It's not meant for a specific individual. It's not meant for a specific time period. It's meant to be self-evident truths about life, and if you're hanging around with the wrong people, it will make your life miserable. The quarrelsome person, will keep an argument going. I mean, is there a person on earth who hasn't experienced that? And the point of it is that you don't always realize that. You're just like, man, why can I not get out of this argument? It's like, well, because you're helping the person, you're feeding the argument. And so, like, there are a great many, quotes from this particular book that they were relevant, 2,500 years ago, and they're relevant today. And they're not necessarily about, morality. They're just about, like, common daily problems, whether it actually has anything to do with your donkey or not. Maybe now it's your lawnmower. But these things, there's a lot of timeless wisdom in Proverbs. In my own personal opinion, I would say that the book of Proverbs may be the most relevant book in the entire Bible to modern people, because so much of it is just dealing with daily problems, with complications, with difficult decisions. It's like you've got this decision to make, and here's this general idea, this general way of approaching the problem. Figure out how to apply it to your particular situation. You know, um, at the same time, there are also parts of it that are like almost abhorrent to modern life. Like the conclusion of it, like the poem of the good wife. When you read it, it's like, okay, this is going to tell me, like how to find a good partner. And it's like the whole thing is basically like, all right, women, this is what you need to do. And for the men out there, you need to pick a woman like this. And it just goes through telling how she should essentially be like financially beneficial to you. She needs to keep your slaves in order. She needs to keep your household running properly. She needs to make sure that, you have your help with your business and everything. And basically, she's almost just like a secretary or a personal assistant who's going to make sure that all of the things you're doing are like she's just working tirelessly to make sure that you succeed. Um, she has like no autonomy. She has no thoughts of her own. She's just there to make your life run more smoothly. And that's like the entire purpose of the poem. And you look at that today and you're like, maybe we don't need that particular part of Proverbs.
Sure.
I think there might
But
be
that
a
doesn't make the
context to
other
it, though.
parts less valid, because the other parts where it talks about like, oh, you have these certain responsibilities and you need to stay focused on them. That is important, whether you're talking about a Bronze Age lifestyle or, like tomorrow at work. Um, and so I think, like with anything, we have to look at it for what the book is. It's a collection of wisdom written by people, over 2,000 years ago. They lived very different lives from us. They had very different ideals, different morals, a different structure. Um, so there will be certain things in here that we can take from the book and apply it to our lives. And the philosophy in it can certainly help us to make decisions and to identify problems in our lives, and it can help make our lives better. And there are also parts of it that should be left in the book. We should say, okay, well, this is literature from an ancient people, and we shouldn't apply these things to today because our morals have progressed beyond what they had. And so, yeah, I definitely wouldn't, toss the whole thing out, and I definitely wouldn't apply the whole thing. Um, I would try to use the wisdom in the book. I would find the stuff that is, you know, self-evident and beneficial and apply that to daily life. And to an extent, I think that the authors of these proverbs, the people who collected them, the people who were trying to teach wisdom to the next generation, to an extent, I think they would appreciate that, because that's what the book is about. It's about learning to have a better life by making better decisions, by seeing better opportunities, by avoiding conflict, by having a more stable and productive society, by implementing this rather complex philosophy that's presented here, that is among the most complex philosophy you'll find in the Old Testament. And so, yeah, I would definitely recommend a lot of this book for any modern reader.
Mhm.
And then, of course, other parts, I'd be like, we've moved beyond that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, to jump on, I would agree that like there's definitely parts we've moved beyond in certain contexts, but to look at that whole like how to find a perfect wife in the context of when it was written, it was like, well, what was the role of the man as opposed to the woman? It's really not that different, because like the atheist critique would be like, well, this one section of Proverbs tells the woman to be subservient, whereas the rest of the Bible tells the man to be subservient to God. So I think a lot of it's just like trying to get men and women on the same page. It's just like, you gotta work together. And it's literally right after, like, hey, don't go after the loose ones. Like, whores are bad. There's the worst example, and here's the best example. So, like, I don't think it's like saying every woman needs to be this, but it's also like the same as giving the example of Jesus to say like every person should be like this. It's kind of an unreachable ideal, an unreachable goal, but it's like to give advice for like how men and women could work together in an ancient context that really wouldn't work that well in today's society, but in the ancient context, I think it's kind of what they needed to hear.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think the whole subordination thing of the wife to the husband and the man subordinating to God, it ties into that, like that pride aspect where I don't know. I would probably call myself more agnostic, but I don't know what God's big plan is and why he needs us to be absolutely subordinated to him. That's just one of those questions you have to kind of answer for yourself. But I always thought it was strange.
Like, why do you have to be terrified of him to gain wisdom and understanding? That kind of thing.
Well, more so, why does he need us to worship him absolutely? Like, what's his big plan? And essentially, he wants us to be like robots. I don't know. It's probably a question we couldn't answer at the end of this podcast.
Well,
Yeah.
he wants you to be free because you have free will. So like I
Well,
don't believe
okay.
in God, but this is the way that Marvin explained it to me, that like free will is integral to Christianity, because if you can't choose God, then you are a slave. You have to have
Sure.
the freedom to say, I love God and I love his way, before you can say that you've actually made the right decision to believe in him. So it gives you the freedom to fail, basically.
Let me throw a wrench right back at you, straight out of Proverbs. If you look at like 20:24, it says, man's goings are of the Lord. And the Lord can control a king's mind as he controls a river. He can direct it as he pleases. So it seems to imply like a paradox that maybe we have free will, but also God can harden the Pharaoh's heart and make you do what he wants you to do.
If you're telling me that God is in charge of everything that my prime minister is doing, then I reject it outrightly. I'll say that right now. I'll say that. I don't want to get any more political than that. No more talk about kings.
Well, maybe this is probably a good spot to like wrap it up. I think we touched on a lot of interesting aspects of Proverbs and identified a couple that we resonated with. Jason Foux, you want to tell people where they can find your most excellent podcast?
If you do a search for Dragons and Genesis on any podcast app, Stitcher, Spreaker, Apple Podcast, whatever, Good Pods, do a search for Dragons and Genesis and look for the big orange logo with a silhouette of Godzilla attacking Jerusalem. That's me. It is the number one Bible study podcast with Godzilla in the logo. Anywhere.
It's awesome.
Good enough.
I figure if I put in enough little qualifications, then I'll be number one. I'll win by default, and that's the best way to win. I also port them over onto YouTube, youtube.com/Dragons and Genesis. And you can also find me on Facebook, where mainly I just post a bunch of memes and then drop links to the latest episodes.
Sure.
Facebook.com/Dragons and Genesis podcast, I believe. Just search Dragons of Genesis and look for the logo.
We'll try to drop
that's
some
the best
links
way to
in the
find me.
description as well.
Yeah, or dragonsandgenesis.com, and go there and you'll
on.
find links to everything.
Perfect.
See, I'm easy to find. I made sure everything was Dragons and Genesis. So,
And because we're a book club podcast, are there any books that you'd recommend regarding maybe the biblical topic or other non-biblical things? For example, I recently started reading this book called The Anatomy of God by Francesca Stavroukopoulos. And
yeah, that
I
is
really
a
like that one.
fantastic. Yes, a brilliant scholar. Yeah, and like her, I was surprised at how extensive her work was. Like, not that I didn't expect her to do like that in depth, but I didn't realize that there was that much content on that topic. Like, I didn't realize you could actually go that deep. I mean, her book, it's as thick as the Bible. It's gigantic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone who wants to learn more about about the origins of God, that is a fantastic book. There's one that I would also recommend to people. I mean, there's a ton of them. I actually have a list on my website, just a bunch of recommended reading. But one that I would really recommend to people, especially if you're wanting to learn more about the origins of God, the evolution of this idea, it's called From Gods to God. I don't remember the author's name. It's difficult for me to pronounce, which means my brain just kind of throws it out and I forget it.
Sure.
But if you look up From Gods to God, what's great about this book is it's written as almost like a collection of essays. Each chapter covers a very specific topic, so you don't have to read it in order. And despite the fact that he goes incredibly deep into every one of these topics, all of the relevant information is presented in that chapter. So you don't have to have any prior knowledge going into this. So not only do you get good scholarly information, you don't need to be a scholar to read or understand it. So yeah, it is a fantastic book. I recommend it to anybody. It's both broad and deep, and because it jumps around to a bunch of individual topics. It's really easy to just pick the thing up, blaze through one chapter, and then come back like a couple weeks later and read another one. You don't have to worry about forgetting something because the next chapter, it's not built on the previous chapter.
I shared my screen
it's its
here.
own self-contained essay.
I shared my screen. Is this the right book here?
And I'll just add one more thing, kind of briefly adding on to that, Jason. If you're looking for something free before you get into From Gods to God, you could check out the Wikipedia article on evolutionary origin of religions. And there's also a really good article on evolution of morality on Wikipedia. So with that said, I want to, just say again that we have been honored to have you on our podcast, Mr. Foux. And Scott, do you want to briefly just mention the other book we're reading? It'll be coming out soon, and then sign us off.
Yeah, we're still continuing with the Holy Bible Book Club. That's going to be going on for a while. The next book that we want to do as a group will be Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. I was on a drive the other day, just sitting in the passenger seat for a couple hours on the way there and back, and I accidentally read Ayn Rand's Anthem. I didn't plan on reading the whole thing, but I just read the whole thing. So, I know Will and I definitely want to get around to this book too, and Fountainhead. So, if you want to get yourself a copy of some Ayn Rand books, might be
I'll think about it.
Okay, so From Gods to God, it's got a big fish on the cover. It's by Avigdor Shinan and Yair Zakovitch.
Okay, yeah,
It should
that's
be the
one.
first thing that pops up on Amazon.
Yeah, that's the
Cool.
screen that I had shared there for a second, so that's perfect.
Okay, yeah, it just came up as a black screen for me.
Okay. Yeah, I'll definitely share a link to your book list and your website and everything, and you can check out our Discord, link in the description. We're on YouTube, youtube.com/bookwave. We're on all of the audio platforms, Spotify and all of the good ones, and bookwave.club is our website. And until next time, may the force be with you.
Namaste.